Ivan the Terrible. Moscow, the 28th of March, 1584. The first man ever crowned Tsar of all Russia sets up a chessboard with his courtier Bogdan Belsky, reaches for a piece, and falls. 53 years old, killed by a stroke before the game begins. This is the list of every ruler of Russia, 4 centuries of them, and exactly how each one died. Ivan is first. When Soviet scientists opened his tomb in 1963, they found his bones soaked in mercury from the ointments he rubbed into aching joints. Poison, some still say. No one has ever proven it. The record calls it a stroke. Peter the Great, Tsar at 10, emperor by sheer force of will, the man who dragged Russia west and raised a capital out of a swamp. In the winter of 1724, his own body turns against him. For years, a diseased bladder and blocked urinary tract have tormented him. Now he cannot pass water at all. Surgeons cut and drain more than a liter of foul, infected urine. For a few days he seems to rally. Then the fever comes back, the poisons flood his blood, and the tissue around his bladder rots into gangrene. Legend says he caught his death saving drowning sailors in the icy Gulf, but the disease already had him. On the 8th of February, 1725, Peter dies in agony in St. Petersburg, the city he willed into being at 52. Catherine the Great ruled for 34 years, a minor German princess who overthrew her own husband and made herself the most powerful woman in Europe. On the morning of the 16th of November, 1796, she rose early, drank her coffee, and sat down to work. Hours later, a servant found her collapsed on the floor of her dressing room, barely breathing. A blood vessel had burst in her brain. She never woke. The next evening, at 67, she was gone, and the autopsy named it plainly, a stroke. Now, the most famous thing about Catherine's death is a lie. You have heard it, that she died beneath a horse. She did not. That story was invented by her enemies after she was already dead, men disgusted that a woman had seized a throne and held it. There was no horse. There was an old empress, alone at her writing desk, and one vessel that finally gave way. Jump forward more than a century, past the emperors who ruled in between, to the last of them all, Nicholas II. War and revolution shatter the monarchy, and in March of 1917 he abdicates. The 300-year Romanov dynasty is over. The Bolsheviks take the family prisoner. By July of 1918, with anti-communist armies closing on the town of Yekaterinburg, the local Soviet rules that no living Romanov can be left behind to be rescued. On the night of the 16th into the 17th, guards wake Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 servants, and lead them down into the cellar of a commandeered house. A short sentence is read aloud. Then the guns. The last Tsar of Russia dies in a basement with his entire household, at 50. The crown that opened with Ivan ends against a cellar wall. Vladimir Lenin, the man who tore down the Tsars and built the Soviet state in their place, is the next to fall, and his body fails him shockingly early. In 1922, at just 51, the first stroke hits. A second follows, then a third. Each one takes more from him. His speech, his right side, his ability to work at all. His final months are spent half paralyzed and nearly wordless at a country estate outside Moscow, watched over by doctors and by rivals already circling his empty chair. On the 21st of January, 1924, a last stroke ends him at 53. The doctor's record hardened, diseased arteries in the brain, the same slow ruin that killed the Tsars he despised. Then, against his own known wishes, his body is embalmed and laid under glass in Red Square, where it still lies today, while the living begin fighting over everything he left behind. Joseph Stalin outlived and outkilled every rival he ever had, and then died like a man abandoned. On the 1st of March, 1953, at his guarded dacha at Kuntsevo outside Moscow, his staff realize he has not stirred all day. They are too frightened of him to open his door uninvited. When they finally dare, they find him on the floor beside his bed, half-dressed, unable to speak, lying in his own urine. A stroke has felled him where he lay. And still no one hurries. Doctors are not summoned for many hours, because calling them without his permission could be a death sentence in itself. For 4 days he lingers, drifting in and out, while the men around him quietly start dividing his power. On the 5th of March, he dies of a massive stroke, at 74. Some insist his deputy Beria had him poisoned. There is no proof, only an old tyrant felled by his own arteries, left on the floor by people too afraid to help him. Nikita Khrushchev is the single ruler on this whole list who lost his throne and lived. In October of 1964, while he is on holiday by the Black Sea, his own colleagues vote him out of power in one afternoon. They do not shoot him. They do the thing the old Tsars never dared. They simply retire him. For 7 years, he lives as a pensioner under quiet watch, gardening, grumbling into a tape recorder, dictating memoirs that are smuggled abroad and published behind the Kremlin's back. On the 11th of September 1971, a heart attack takes him at 77. The state that once hung on his every word gives him no state funeral and no place by the Kremlin wall, only a quiet grave in a Moscow cemetery. The man who once banged his fist at the whole world dies an ordinary old man, out of power, and almost out of the story. Leonid Brezhnev ruled for 18 slow years, and by the end he was a monument that could barely walk, slurring, heavily medicated, propped up in front of the cameras. On the 10th of November 1982, he simply does not wake up. A heart attack takes him in his sleep at 75, in his bed outside Moscow. For a country that boasted endlessly about the future, the men at its very top were suddenly all running out of it. Brezhnev's death opens the strangest stretch in Soviet history. A run of old, dying men handed the most powerful job on earth, one after another after another. Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB, takes the throne already dying. Within months, his kidneys fail completely, and from early 1983, the Soviet Union is effectively run out of a hospital room, the leader kept alive by a dialysis machine, while the public is told almost nothing. On the 9th of February 1984, his body gives out entirely, total kidney failure, and he is gone at 69, after barely 15 months in charge. They bury him, and then reach, unbelievably, for a man who is even sicker. Konstantin Chernenko is a lifelong heavy smoker whose lungs are already destroyed by emphysema before he ever takes office. He can barely climb a flight of stairs. He addresses the nation, gasping for air. 13 months is all he manages. On the 10th of March 1985, his failing heart and ruined lungs stop at 73. Count them: Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. 3 leaders of a superpower dead in 28 months, each one lowered into the ground to the very same funeral march. The Soviet gerontocracy did not fall. It died of old age, in public, one state funeral at a time. So the party does something desperate. It hands power to a man of just 54, young, healthy, alive. Mikhail Gorbachev tries to reform the Soviet Union, and instead presides over its collapse. In 1991, the country he leads simply ceases to exist, and he becomes a ruler without a realm. He lives on for another 3 decades, a private citizen in a Russia that no longer wants him. On the 30th of August, 2022, at 91, Mikhail Gorbachev dies in a Moscow hospital. The hospital says only that he passed after a long and serious illness, and gives no specific cause at all. He is the last leader the Soviet Union ever had, and he outlived the Soviet Union itself by more than 30 years. President Putin sends flowers to the coffin and does not attend the funeral. Boris Yeltsin is the first president of an entirely new country, the Russian Federation, that rose out of the wreckage. He stood on top of a tank to face down a coup, then spent a decade presiding over chaos, economic collapse, and a failing heart of his own, surviving quintuple bypass surgery while still in office. On the very last day of 1999, he stunned the world by resigning, handing the Kremlin to a little-known former spy he had just made prime minister. 7 years later, on the 23rd of April, 2007, Boris Yeltsin dies of congestive heart failure in a Moscow hospital at 76. He is the 12th ruler on this list to be lowered into the ground. The man he handpicked to replace him is the 13th, and that one is still here. Vladimir Putin. Born in 1952, in power since the dawn of the century, ruling Russia longer now than anyone since Stalin. And here the list stops, because there is nothing to write in the final column. Look back down it. A stroke over a chessboard, a rotted bladder, a burst vessel at a writing desk, a family shot in a cellar, 3 old men buried in a single Moscow winter. 4 centuries of Russian rulers, and almost every one of them died in harness, killed by their own bodies as often as by their enemies, the throne itself outlasting them all. Only the last name has no date beside it. The 13th ruler of Russia is not finished. His row is still blank, and the man on the throne tonight is still, for now, very much alive. If you want the full story of the Tsars alone, one by one, and exactly how each of them met their end, that video is waiting on the channel right now.